Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Wednesday, July 22nd, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square, Washington's state government reporter. Now to Seattle and her budget woes. Councilman Bob Kettle, Seattle City Councilman Bob Kettle, sent a letter on Tuesday to Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson and other budget leads on the council and other budget employees in her office concerning proposed budget reforms and addressing the structural budget deficit. That was kind of the title of his letter, if you will. And in that letter, Kettle wrote this. He said Seattle's projected budget deficit has ballooned to 175 million for next year, even though general fund revenue, primarily property sales, utility, business, payroll, taxes, have grown dramatically to over 2 billion. He points out that's up 17% from 1.72 billion in 2024 and up 40% from 1.44 billion in 2019. Meanwhile, he says we have asked voters to shoulder additional property tax levies for separate programs every year for the past 6 years. The ever increasing tax burden funding new and expanded programs, layered on top of the ongoing affordability crisis, is hampering everyday Seattleites' abilities to make ends meet. So I chatted with Councilman Kettle yesterday, just ahead of him going into a Seattle City Council meeting. He told me he would like to see the city really use some fiscal restraint. And he pointed to King County facing a severe budget deficit of their own, which has forced some significant recent structural changes and reductions in some King County departments. So he gave some credit to King County and said, we here in Seattle maybe need to take an approach of the same kind of fiscal restraint.
That is the kind of decision making and leadership that we need here in the city. This is what the council needs to be looking at as we move forward. We need to understand, do we need to have these offices or departments? And much like the county did, much credit to Executive Sahalai because he did that. And I think the county is going to be in a much better position moving forward over the next number of years. And so that is kind of like an example for us to follow. And in some ways, we should be leading with that. And that's kind of how I've been thinking about this. And really in my letter and in my blog, I'm really looking to push forward with that kind of thinking. Because if we have that kind of thinking, I believe that we can make some good decisions that allows us to be focused on those things that we need to be taking care of, our charter responsibilities, those main responsibilities, but then maybe freeing up overhead, for example. There's some high salaries, there's some high overhead costs to the city, and there might be opportunities there.
So he had a couple of specific points in his letter to the mayor urging, sort of restructuring of budget priorities. He said they need to stop just kind of carrying over. Okay, this was last year's budget. Boom, this is sort of our baseline. We're starting here now, add in some inflation and a couple of other new pet projects, and boom, we got to grow from last year's budget to this year's budget by X number of dollars. And he says that's no longer an approach that they can afford to take. Not assuming programs that they had last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago are ones that are serving the city of Seattle and taxpayers well. So he also suggested that there's a lot of money being spent on programs that might benefit only interest groups. He brought up the Office of Economic Development and noted that they hire consultants at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars for things like, he mentioned, the green economy strategy. So instead, he wants the mayor and the council to take a hard look at things like that. That may make some sense since they've got this, growing budget deficit. And he wants the mayor to potentially also consider lowering the high income earners payroll tax in the city, which we've talked about. Some companies have relocated some of their highest earning employees just across the lake over to Bellevue and Redmond so they can avoid having to pay this payroll tax. You can maybe work in the city, but you live over there, you don't have to pay it. So now Kettle is one of the somewhat more moderate voices on the Seattle City Council. So I asked him straight up in our interview on Tuesday, this is great. This all sounds like it makes a lot of sense. Maybe rein in that crazy budget. But Is anybody going to listen to you? Is socialist Mayor Katie Wilson going to listen to you? Is the very progressive left leaning rest of the Seattle City Council going to listen to you? And he said he believes that some members are actually kind of waking up to this and that he might have an ear from some other members of the council.
And I think there's a greater understanding today of the impacts of like public safety, for example. And our public safety posture downtown has had an impact on commercial properties. And that has had an impact now with the devaluation on the residential piece because it gets shifted from the commercial side to the residential side. So people should not be surprised if they have to put more money into their escrow accounts. That is a big pitch. This kind of goes to my affordability points that I was making in the last piece of legislation related to the Seattle Transit Measure, that we have to look at the affordability pieces, whether it's, in terms of property taxes, and this shows up in escrow, it shows up in higher rents. We should be looking at the levies in those areas too. Sales tax, we're just going through that process right now, and that's a cumulative effect. And then like utility rates, people are starting to feel it, but this is going to be a big bite of us, in terms of what's happening. So we have to look at how do we strengthen those revenue sources, those traditional revenue sources, B&O, real estate, excise tax, all these kinds of taxes. How can we stabilize them and build them, because we have these other pressures? And I don't see really that kind of thinking going on. So this is one reason why I I sent my letter to the mayor, but then also, with my blog, it's basically a 2-page summary of that same piece with a little bit more background to it, and making the argument that we cannot do business as we've been doing it thus far.
I did reach out to the office of Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson for their reaction to this letter and the blog post that went out from Councilmember Kettle on Tuesday. As of the time of this podcast, I had not received any response from the office, but I will be putting up a more complete article about all of this on our Center Square Washington page later today. And if I receive any response from Mayor Wilson's office, I certainly will include that in my article. So that's a wrap on today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily for this Wednesday, July the 22nd. As always, we really appreciate you watching and encourage you to check out our Center Square Washington page and join us again for another episode on Thursday.